Madam President, I come to the chamber to talk about a devastating event we've experienced in North Carolina. Last month, Hurricane Matthew skirted along the Atlantic coast, and then it plowed right through North Carolina with devastating results. Matthew is the worst storm we've experienced in almost 20 years, and it's already responsible for taking some 28 lives. Millions of people in North Carolina and across the country watched the storm made landfall. But after a few days, many of them turned their attention back to their daily lives. I don't fault them for doing this because unless you're there and you see it firsthand, it's really easy to think it was just a lot of rain and a storm that came and went, but it's far worse than that. Thousands of adults and children will take years to recover from the devastation that they've experienced over the last month. First opportunity I had to survey the damage was just 2 days after the hurricane made landfall. I traveled across the state in a helicopter with the Commissioner of Agriculture, and it was remarkable what I saw. In fact, it was after the rain had occurred, but before the floods began, almost a week later. In fact, it was the next week that I spent a day with many of my staff and volunteers doing volunteer work down in one of the areas that was hit hard by the flood. We worked with the American Red Cross, the Baptist men, and the Salvation Army, who were trying to prepare food and provide shelter for so many people who were displaced. And then last week I was back in the area and I had an opportunity to witness firsthand the farm damage and one of our major areas just outside of Fort Bragg, urban area that was hit very, very hard. Over the course of the last 3 weeks, I've literally seen long stretches of interstate highways underwater. I've seen major roads completely washed out. I've seen entire communities underwater. I've seen a couple of towns that have been completely washed away. Some of them were washed away just 20 years ago. And I've seen farms that were either underwater for a period of time where their crops are rotting in the field now. And in other cases, farmers had harvested their crops and had already prepared the fields for the next planting season. Now they're covered with sand and debris. I've heard heartbreaking stories from victims and rescue workers, and I'm going to share some of those stories with you, but also heard some heartwarming stories about the responsiveness of our local and state and federal agencies and the kindness of neighbors and volunteers. Madam President, I want to thank the state and local officials in FEMA and the first responders who are doing an excellent job in some of the most difficult circumstances. But the death and destruction caused by Hurricane Matthew is really impossible to comprehend. The 28 lives we lost are a cross-section of the state. There are parents and grandparents, sons and daughters, leaders of our community, and young people who had their entire life ahead of them. One of the victims was Charles Ivey. He was a resident of Lumberton, one of the areas hardest hit, some 19 inches of rain over 24 hours. He was a pillar of his community. Charles served as a deacon at the Sunday school director at West Lumberton Baptist Church. He was an active member of Lumberton Lions Club, JC's, the County Fair Board, and West Lumberton Community Watch. He was a loving father of 2 daughters, 4 grandchildren, and he leaves behind his wife, Wanda. Another victim who perished as a result of the storms was Isabel Rawls of Godwin. She was a resilient woman. She survived cancer, triple bypass surgery, and kidney failure. She devoted her life to others, spending years as a caregiver for the Peace Corps. She was a Sunday school teacher, and she was the church historian at Spring Hills Baptist Church. Her family and friends always remember her as a phenomenal woman who was a role model and an inspiration in her faith in God. Madam President, these are just a couple of the stories about the victims of Hurricane Matthew. They were all probably people I could tell stories about. They were mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, loving friends. 28 precious lives lost in total. I hope the family and friends of the victims know that millions of North Carolinians and people across the nation are praying for them and for their recovery. But the loss of life alone was devastating, but it's really not the total story. In fact, we have years left to recover. Hurricane Matthew was a massive storm. To give you an idea, it's what's referred to as a 1,000-year flood event. In other words, for this area, statistically speaking, it'll be another 1,000 years before they see the amount of water dumped in the period of time. It was a 500-year flood event for a massive part of eastern North Carolina. Thousands of people were forced out of their homes and moved to shelters. Many are still in temporary housing, and thousands of the homes are not habitable. The storm-flooded areas that were well outside of the 100-year floodplain, so most of them, or many of them, didn't have flood insurance. Last week, I visited one of those communities. It's a Habitat for Humanity community. It has some 90 homes that were built over the last 15, 16 years. 60 of them were underwater. 60 of them are not habitable. 60 families are displaced. The pain is, as I said before, just hard to imagine. It's immeasurable. To give you an idea, we've talked to we have reports of several victims, but I've summarized a few. Ann Johnson's one from Lenore County, another county that was hard hit. She was one of the many persons